Hello guys, in this video President Joe Biden facing off against a liberal Republican governor from the state of Vermont, Phil Scott. This would be a very weird election map, and the only way scenario that Phil Scott wins a primary is through like a contested convention or something as like the compromise candidate. But this will be a very weird map, and we're just going to go through it. Let's fill in the safe blue states. So these western states really wouldn't be competitive sides, not in the New England region where Phil Scott would make a lot of safe blue states competitive. But let's go on with the rest of these. These would just be safe red regardless. I mean, they're not going to vote for Biden just because there's a more centrist Republican on the ballot. They'll still vote for him by over 10%, just out of opposition towards Biden. Phil Scott would do very well in Alaska, DC, Maryland. These states would still be safe, Democratic, Delaware, New York. Okay, I think we could start off with these first few states. So we'll start off with New England. Phil Scott, I know this might be a bold prediction. I really do think he would take his home state of Vermont. He won the Vermont governorship by like 71 points. He has a higher approval rating than Biden does in this state. So I really think that would factor into a victory for him. Plus, again, Phil Scott admitted to voting for Biden in the 2020 election. So I really do think he could appeal well to Democrats here. He would be socially liberal but fiscally conservative, but I think a lot of Dems could stomach voting for that in the state of Vermont. I think he would be able to win it as a very popular governor, one of the most popular in the country. And that would also help him get a win in New Hampshire. He'd probably win it by a likely margin just due to that home region advantage. But Massachusetts would still be likely Democratic. Connecticut and Rhode Island, I would say Rhode Island would still be likely Democratic, while Connecticut actually gets very competitive. It goes into the lean blue margin. Phil Scott could have a chance at winning the state. Maine at large, though, know what? I think he could pull off a slight victory, sort of like a Phil or a Susan Collins victory in the state. Probably win Maine's second by a likely Republican margin in Maine's first district because he's fairly centrist on issues. I could see him doing decent with Democrats in the state. Okay, the next few states. Texas and Florida, they would still be likely red. There'll be a drop off in rural areas in voting, but I still think Phil Scott would be able to win these states by a likely margin just due to their opposition towards Biden. In Colorado, I could see Phil Scott being enough of a liberal Republican to do well in Colorado, bring it down to a likely margin. Still not a victory. Same with New Mexico. Still not a victory. In the state of Iowa, just due to their opposition towards Biden, I still think he'd win, even though there'd be a drop-off in populist voters, not just voting at all, or maybe even just voting for Biden. I just still think he would win it by a likely margin just due to the Biden's very low approval rating in Iowa. In New Jersey, I would still consider it a likely Democratic state. It would barely be a Biden 8-point victory against Phil Scott, but he would do well with a lot of independents voters here and moderates as well. In Ohio, I'd see it as a lean Republican state. Again, this is where the populist voter is not turning out to vote hurts Phil Scott because he's such a centrist on the issues. So I definitely see him hurting him in the rural areas here, but still a victory for him. And North Carolina and Georgia, we've seen establishment Republicans win here before, so I still think Phil Scott would win North Carolina and still win Georgia by a narrow margin against Joe Biden. I still think Biden wins Virginia by about 2 to 3 points against Phil Scott. He would definitely make the state of Virginia competitive, but then again, former Trump voters not turning out to vote for Phil Scott would hurt him in this state. But he would improve upon that with a decent margin in the suburbs, but he would have a lot of losses in the rural areas. Okay, Nevada and Arizona. I still think these states narrowly vote for Joe Biden because there would be a drop-off in these more very Republican areas and the rural areas. They really wouldn't turn out as much to vote for Phil Scott, mainly because he's just he's not conservative enough on the issues, and they just probably wouldn't bother voting. Okay, so in the Rust Belt states, I still think, honestly, I could see him edging out a victory in Nebraska second. I think he would be the right type of Republican to win that district. In Minnesota, it would be a lean margin. Michigan, a lean margin, because, again, he would miss out on all those populist voters and more conservative voters in the rural areas, and those margins be diminished among them. So, with any gains he make among more moderate independent voters, he would make big losses in those rural areas and just not get their votes, which is why I think he loses nearly every state in the Rust Belt. Maybe Wisconsin he can make decently competitive. But then again, Phil Scott literally admitted to voting for Biden in 2020, so I really think that would make the conservative base mad in these states, and they just wouldn't bother voting for him. So, a narrow victory by Joe Biden, extremely weird electoral map, but this honestly probably what it would look like in a Phil Scott-Joe Biden matchup. So let me know what you think of this video in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.